Greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining us at the Progressive Forum. We're the world's only expressly progressive lecture series, and we're based in Houston, Texas. I'm Randall Morton, founder of the Forum. We're excited to present acclaimed religious historian Karen Armstrong in the American launch event for her latest book, Sacred Nature: Restoring Our Ancient Bond with the Natural World. I'm grateful to our sponsor who made the in-person event and this free live stream possible, my friend Ann Hamilton, whose career catalyzed the environmental movement here in America's fourth largest city and blessed us with the vast green spaces and parks we have today. This live stream is a recorded version of our recent in-person event in Houston and serves our worldwide progressive mission, reaching thousands. You can view the recording on our website indefinitely. To purchase this important book at a discount, click the link under the screen, and our terrific partners at Blue Willow Bookshop will send you a copy. And I hope you'll consider a donation to the Progressive Forum, which is voluntary, starting as low as $5 on up to several thousand. Just click the donation link. We especially need your support now because just before Karen Armstrong's appearance, I got the biggest surprise of my career. Our venue lost power and air conditioning. Our amazing team managed to set up a small room to record this live stream for you. I'm sorry somebody missed her in person, but the intimacy of this live stream makes it a treat. We refunded all the tickets and lost $35,000 on the event. The Progressive Forum does big things, but $35,000 is a setback. So if you can support our unique progressive mission in a big way, we'd appreciate it. Karen Armstrong is a best-selling author whose celebrated titles include The History of God and her memoir as a former nun, The Spiral Staircase. Her works have been translated into 45 languages. She is a United Nations Ambassador for the Alliance of Civilization and lives in London. I give you Karen Armstrong.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Here we are in slightly different circumstances from usual. I'm starting off in China in the 17th century. At that time, the Jesuits from Europe came over as missionaries, and they got on very well with the Confucians there. They wore Chinese clothes, they spoke Chinese, and they did well with the Confucians. But the Confucians really took in everything. They weren't upset, as people had been in Europe, by about Galileo's ideas, or the Earth being round, or the various seasons and things. But one thing really stuck in their throats. They could not get into their head the idea of a God in a tiny quarter of the universe that he had created in one of the seventh heavens, and as a distant figure. They said, you know, the Jesuits, they understand things very well, but they don't understand what they call the qi. In China, we'll see in a moment, that the qi was not a god in heaven. It was a sacred force that flowed through all things, that it inspired. It was in everything. It pervaded the earth. It was not a god in a distant heaven, or a person even a personal god, but it was a sacred force. And they said, the Jesuits are very good about science, but they don't understand the qi. And some years back before that, when the Crusaders had started to arrive in the Holy Land, and lots of pilgrims were coming out to the Holy Land, the Greek Orthodox were really puzzled to see the ecstasy. When they arrived in the Holy Land, they would burst into tears, fling themselves on the ground and kiss the ground and say, "This is holy, this is the Holy Land," and crawl on all fours to make the most of it. And they said, what on earth are they doing? Don't they understand that all land is holy? Their land is just as holy as ours. So the West, quite early, went off into a different tangent. And then, of course, when we started to rule the earth, things have become rather bad for the environment. And I'll look at that in a moment. So the Chinese, for example, as I said, saw the sacred as a force. It was neither physical nor wholly spiritual. It flowed through all things. It was in constant motion, bringing things into being and letting other things go to one side, constantly roiling. And it was present in all things. And in India, too, it was a very, very similar idea of what they called Rita, or later they'd call it Brahman. Another force that goes through, that is in all things, that is active in all things. That Brahman wasn't created by a god. Brahman created the gods. Just as Brahman created the mountains and the sea and the fish, and was in constant motion, keeping the earth in being, constantly a sacred force, constantly in touch. And so the West had gone off in a different direction. Now, Thomas Aquinas, in the 12th century, he understood this. But he was writing in rather dry Aristotelian prose. By this time, the Europeans had just discovered Aristotle. When they'd gone down to Spain, because in the Dark Ages, they'd remembered Plato, but all Aristotle's work had been lost. And they recovered Aristotelian science by going down to Spain, where the Muslims who'd translated Aristotle into Arabic and studied Aristotle, they could teach them about Aristotle. So it was the big craze. Everyone was thrilled this was the biggest, newest thing, and Thomas Aquinas was full of Aristotle. The trouble with Aristotle, excellent though he was in many ways, is that he's rather a boring, prosaic writer, where the other would talk about Chi or Brahman in terms of poetry and in music and in dance. They did it in Aristotelian prose, which rather put a dampener on things. There was a real divide from a very early age between the West and the rest of the world. And of course, when we became very, very powerful, we sent this limited view of the divine took with us missionaries, and so the thing has gone on. But the Chinese were not alone, of course, because in India, the same force was Rita, as I've said, or later they would call it Brahman. And it too, just the Chinese would also call it Tao, the way things are, the way things really are. And it's ineffable. You can't seal it down and say the Tao is over there, or like you can say that God is in the heavens, because it is everywhere. It keeps everything in being. and is in all things. So all things, therefore, are sacred, and that, of course, includes the things of nature. But so this is a kind of, as I say, an archetypal idea, because it emerges too in the monotheistic religions. You have it in Jewish Kabbalah. Their mystical experience also shows a kind of force, a sacred force that is ubiquitous and everywhere, just rather like Brahma. And similarly, the Greeks never lost their pagan view of sacred nature, because Artemis, the great goddess Artemis, was one of the most powerful gods in the Greek world. She was the goddess of nature, and she was in everything, invisible. You never saw her, but she was there in every plant, in every tree, in every rock, in the sea. And even though they didn't believe in Artemis anymore, the Christians had imbibed this view of nature, and so the Greek Orthodox never quite lost that view of nature as we did in the West. So this sacred force that is, you can't define it, you can't see it, but it is everywhere. That is really our God stuck in a small corner of, as the Chinese thought, of the universe that he had supposedly created, is lost. Our Father who art in heaven, we say. Heaven had become a very distant thing, a very different place, distant place by the 17th century. So it was quite easy to lose sight of God. But also in the Greek Orthodox remembered Artemis, and it appears very much in the monk who was very well known in the West at first. Thomas Aquinas quotes him constantly. He's called Denis, the Areopagite, after St. Paul's first convert, first in Greece. It was a pseudonym. We don't know what his real name was. But he had this view of sacred nature, a force except he didn't quite see it as rolling out in a sort of way. It was a sort of like a constant explosion into the world, like a kind of orgasm that was constantly keeping the world in being, constantly invigorating everything. But we were going off, as I say, in a different direction, starting with the Aristotelian notion, and this started to get really serious in about the 17th century, when you have Bacon, 16th century Bacon was, who said that God had said, after all, he says, in the book of Genesis, the first chapter of Genesis, he said to Adam, "Take the earth and subdue it. Take the earth and conquer it." And Adam, said Bacon, Adam sinned. And he did not do what God told him. He did not subdue the earth. But we now, modern people, we can subdue the earth. We can do what God wants and make the earth inferior to us, make it our servant. And later, of course, the philosophers, Descartes, for example, who saw nature as nature was no longer sacred. He said, "My aim is to make it so that when you see a flower or a star, you will no longer wonder at it. You'll no longer be filled with awe and wonder and mystery, because it's just a thing. It is just an inanimate thing, And we must look at all the things of nature as inanimate. And his God was, imagined God as up in the heavens, creating the earth, rather like a scientist, putting everything together and setting everything up, and then disappearing back to heaven, and the earth is now working on its own. So that was moving quite fast, far away from the traditional way, and we used this new science of ours to make ourselves in the West what we became, a world leader, and taking our scientific view of the world with us into other parts. But in places like India and China, the old idea of God has not completely died. It is still there, very much so. But for us, that notion of a God that is everywhere. My catechism as a child said, "Where is God?" And the answer was, "God is everywhere." But somehow he wasn't. He was in heaven, and he was distant, and one felt this distance, and one could never get to him. Whereas, if you're used to sort of looking at nature properly, you see the divine in every tree, in every bird, in the sky, in the stars, everywhere. God is where is God? God is everywhere, but we no longer see it like that. And so the Muslims of the three monotheists have the best view of nature. They see God as the creator, but they still they revere nature. And if you think, that is really very remarkable, in that the Quran was composed in what is now Saudi Arabia, in that hideous climate. And the Arabs, before the coming of Islam, had no time for nature at all. Not surprisingly, they could not, in that sterile country, produce enough food for everybody. So they had to steal food from one another. You had to do it very carefully. You couldn't just go and kill everybody and then take off because if you did that, you'd have a vendetta and they'd come back for you. The skill was to go into the homes and get the stuff without killing anybody. It was the only way that they were able to survive. And then you get the Quran praising the glories of nature. Whereas we in the West are most impressed by miracles. We love miracle stories where the rules of nature get turned upside down or don't work anymore. So odd things happen. So we think that's miraculous and a sign of God. But the Quran is far closer to the Chinese and the Indians in that respect. It sees the hand of God in nature itself, and it, that every morning that the sun rises, and every night it sets, and this is God. The trouble with the Quran is that people in the West read it in translation, and you're not meant to read it. It is chanted and it sung, and the Arabic is extremely beautiful, and which we don't see, and it is sung, chanted, and it's a great skill to be able to recite the Quran in that way. And people have competitions to see who can do it best. It's a very great art. But so when people say, "Well, I've read the Quran," and they say it in a very sort of I know it all way, I say, "Well, you haven't. You're not supposed to read it. You're supposed to listen to it, and the beauty of the sound it speaks to you." So that's just a bit of a sort of little divergence there. So this archetypal notion is there in humanity, and I think we see it very strongly in the Romantic poets of the 19th century. Because at that time, in the early 19th century, people like Wordsworth and Coleridge were very much alarmed at the way industry was thriving, and how we were getting more into towns and cities, and we're going even farther away from nature. And he said, as a young boy, he used to be intoxicated with the glories of nature. And I remember that myself as a child. When I was very, very little, I could see, when we went into the woods around my home in Worcestershire, I could see a light, a sort of strange light, a luminousness in the trees, and I kept on pointing it out to my parents. I didn't have much vocabulary at that time, so I called it pooch, pooch. And they said, yes, dear. You know, and they said, she's pretending that she's seeing the fairies, you know, in my picture. No, it's pooch, I said very indignantly. But of course, when I went to school, like Wordsworth, the light and glory died away, and as Wordsworth says, and faded into the light of common day, as I was inducted into the rationalistic viewpoint that we have here in the West. But anyway, Wordsworth taught himself, he says, and he says it in his wonderful poem, Tintern Abbey, he taught himself to look at nature differently. And what he came up with is exactly like Chi or Brahman or Tao. He says, for I have learned to look on nature, not as I did as a young boy, but hearing oftentimes the still sad music of humanity, nor harsh, no, nor harsh, nor grating, though of ample power to chasten and subdue. And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that informs all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. Now that is Chi, Brahman, Tao. It's in us. It's there in our humanity. If we can only look for it. It's a sort of archetypal idea that is fundamental to us. And he's quite clear this isn't God, because notice he said he is quite happy to write about God in other poems, but not this, because God has come to mean something very different, that being way up in the sky, far out of our reach, or looking down upon us. He calls it something. Now, we use the word something, don't we, very loosely. What shall we have for supper? I don't know, eggs or something. But Wordsworth uses language very precisely, and it's something. We haven't got a name for it, but it's something. Do look at that poem if you can find it, because that says it. That has it all. It's in the poem Tintern Abbey. Now, he says he's learned to look on nature, and we can do that too, as I believe. And so in my book, it's a sort of how-to book in a sense, because I look at the way people looked at nature in the past. And then there's the end of each chapter, there's a place called the way forward, how we can translate that into our daily lives. And so that one of the things is, for example, to sort of try and look at nature differently. We don't often look at it these days. I mean, I don't know, how often have you gone to a place of natural beauty and seen somebody marching up by the sea, for example, talking on his iPhone? or else taking endless photographs of this wonderful view. They can't possibly look at them all. I mean, you know, they're far too many. But we seem to prefer an artificial, man-made replica of nature rather than being in nature's presence itself. We're not doing that. And it's the same. I work quite a lot in the British Museum. And then it's exactly the same thing going on in there. People come, there's the Rosetta Stone, and what do? We take about 20 photographs of it. Instead of saying, this is the Rosetta Stone, or these people, this is from ancient Egypt. I'm in the presence of something else. We're looking at nature increasingly, withdrawing from it into a sort of virtual world. So I have tried to suggest, as I say, in each of these chapters, things that you could do. For example, when we've been talking about the qi, just spend 10 minutes a day to start with, turning off your phones, sitting in your garden or in a park, or if you're lucky enough to live in the countryside, and look at nature. See all the insects and the life and the birds and the sounds, just for 10 minutes. No phone, no books, just sitting in the presence of nature. And you can up your time as you go on, but just to reconnect. That is basic, because we seem to be retreating from it at an alarming and very peculiar rate. But another way of looking at this is the golden rule. Never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself. That, as I've written in elsewhere, is one of the great sort of symbols, the great teachings, and it's in every single world religion, seen as the essence of conduct and spirituality. Why? Because you have to look into your own heart, discover what gives you pain, and then refuse under any circumstance whatsoever to inflict that pain on anybody else. Do not impose on others, said Confucius, what you yourself do not desire. Confucius, as far as we know, was the first to enunciate the golden rule and say it was essential to his teaching. And later, Confucians, what they call themselves later, before the Neo-Confucians, Mencius, a couple of centuries later, said, yes, Confucius is talking very much about human beings, and that is very important, that we treat all people as we would wish to be treated ourselves. But this also applies to the things of nature, what he calls the Wanwu. And that's, in English, it's always translated the things of nature. Now, we use the word thing, don't we, to to point to something that's really a bit inanimate, that's just, or that hasn't really got a name or an identity, or but it's not certainly not a living thing, as it is for the Chinese, who have cultivated a sense that everything has a life of its own that has to be respected. Now, that doesn't mean we start anthropomorphizing everything and sort of talking to nature as though it can talk back to us, or put, what they call the pathetic fallacy of feeling, putting our feelings into nature. No, it means just being in the presence of nature and sensing its difference, its majesty. And it's our, we are dependent upon it for the entire time, everything we breathe and live. So to spend time, the Neo-Confucians in the 11th century really went a lot on this. And they said every single thing, and of course for them a thing is not just a dead thing, it's filled with sacred life. Every single thing has a particular nature. And we mustn't say, oh, and start talking to flowers and trees, because they've got a different nature from ours. Their life is pulsing within each tree, each flower, each insect, but it's different from ours. And we must recognize that. There's a tree I have when I'm sitting in my desk at home, and I live in the middle of London, and you know, there's not much nature going on there. But in the next street, there's a massive tree that is in a schoolyard, and it rises above the houses opposite me. And I watch, and it's directly opposite my desk at the top of the house. And I sometimes make myself watch this tree for a while. And you start seeing, especially, it's not so good in the summer when it's full of leaves, but when you see it, as it starts paring itself down, you see how it changes in color, texture. You see all the creatures that are coming into it, the absolute teeming life in that tree, but it's different from us. Just as a wasp has a different reality from us, and that is utterly mysterious to us. That we you know, all those children's books which have you know, animals dressed as in human clothes and chatting, it doesn't do any harm. But we should now start recognizing the sacred difference in every tree and every flower. And that's, the Neo-Confucians were very, very strong on that. One of them said that every single thing, which again does not have that sort of deadening concept that we have for a thing, it has its own life, its own integrity, its own nature, and we must study this and trying to understand it, study it scientifically, intellectually, and recognize that other life that is there all around us in everything. And we can start doing that, just noticing as we sit in the garden, the birds, for example, who have an entirely different life from us, and the insects and the leaves, just reconnecting with nature, just for a start, 10 minutes a day. The Chinese called it quiet sitting. That didn't mean you had to sit in the yogic position or anything. You can just sit comfortably and in a relaxed way, but put away your phones. Well, they didn't have phones in those days, but they put away their books and their scrolls and just watched, listened. Wordsworth said, have a heart, cultivate a heart that watches and receives. Watch and receives. So the Neo-Confucians, I love them, and in my book they appear really quite frequently, especially in the last chapter. And there's another thing that we have to. There's one of my chapters is called Concentric Circles. That this is something that the Chinese developed again. And what they would do was sit in the center of their own circle, in the center of their own life, in their own society, but then go outwards, moving outwards to other things, the things of nature, entering into that, and entering into the difficult things, entering to the sky, the birds, the storms. Just becoming aware, moving your mind out. You start perhaps with yourself, but then group slowly out, so perhaps your children, then to animals, which are closest to us, then to insects or fish, then further out to grass and leaves, and just recognizing that sacrality that is, as Wordsworth said, in all things. But that's just one of the practices. And a great practice in the ancient world, which really needs to be to be understood properly, is sacrifice. Now we instantly become rather sort of touchy about this and say how cruel it is to sacrifice animals. But we don't seem to spend the same amount of time lamenting the millions of beasts who are slaughtered every day quite heartlessly in our abattoirs without anybody taking any notice. In the ancient world, you really didn't eat red meat unless it was sacrificed, unless it was made holy. But in India, they became so squeamish about this that they used to let the animal go in the end. They sacralized it, made it holy, but often they would give it to one of the priests as a gift. But the idea is it's to make holy, to recognize the absolute sacrality in everything around us. That's something that we should be looking at, that every single flower and tree and plant and insect has its own sacred life, its own holiness. Sacred means other, separate. So it's different from ours, no anthropomorphizing there. But to make holy, in India they had these tremendously complex rituals which honored nature, but very few people could attend these. These were just really for very, very learned priests. But the ordinary people were told to make sacrifice. Says in another way, that this didn't mean killing anybody. Sacrum facere, it comes from, to make holy. So a person was told, everyone was supposed to honor every single person you met during the day. In India, as you know, they will bow like that, and recognizing that holiness. And you are to welcome any guest to your house, whether you like him or her or not, and wait upon him, treat him with utter respect, or her with utter happiness and joy, as if to see her, and reverence. Whoever it is, you must, at every moment of the day, honor every guest that you encounter, and the same in the street. And also, you must remember the dead. Remember that just every day in the dead, they would have a fire, a sacred fire in each home, and they would perhaps throw some incense or something into it as it would go up to heaven, or just to remember the dead, the sacrality of the dead, once a day in our lives, just to remember that. Then they said you did scriptural study. Now that did not mean you took out your Rig Veda or the Bible or do a lot of work in that way. No, because because every single thing that you encounter is holy. So you can just sit quietly. You might have a poem, say, a favorite poem, just for 10 minutes a day, with your eyes on the horizon, letting the sounds of nature in, and as it were, saying thank you to nature with a poem, just bringing it into our lives. We need that because we have so sidelined the natural world. It's a sort of background to us, not something on which we depend. Holiness, one of the things about what makes things holy is something we've lost the touch with it, really, But it means, one of its meanings is that we have within ourselves a feeling of utter dependence upon it. And we utterly depend upon nature for every breath that we take. And we're seeing now disturbances in nature and beginning to find life uncomfortable. But the thing to do is to recognize when things are normal, that this is holy. This is sacred, special, precious, and on which we absolutely depend. And to bring these thoughts into our minds at various parts of the day, just perhaps reading a poem, for example, or taking time to sit in the garden or the park for 10 minutes, just taking nature in. Those are things that we can do. So also the Jains. The Jains had a very strict view of nature. They revered it so much that they were very, very fearful, very fearful indeed of hampering it in any way, harming it. So a Jain will walk very, very carefully to make sure that it doesn't tread on an insect, or it would never swat a fly, or some Jains go rather too extreme, I feel. They just never move. They stand there and virtually starve themselves to death. I think that is taking things a little too far. But just being careful as to what there's a lovely, I quote it in the book, there's a lovely piece in the wonderful novel Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Sterne in the 18th century, one of the very first English novels. It's an extraordinary book. And one of the characters is a man called Uncle Toby. He's a very lovable, dear character, the hero's uncle. And the narrator, Tristram Shandy, he says he'll never forget the time that one day he was standing, there was at lunch, and this fly was buzzing around, and buzzing around him, going round and round the table, and this had been annoying everybody. But eventually, Uncle Toby got him, and he carried him out instead of swatting him, carried him out, talking to it gently, saying, "Now, dear fly, thou hast as much right to live as I," and gently opens the window and lets the fly out. And the narrator says, the narrator Tristram Shandy says he never forgot that somehow. And I think that's something we could all do instead of just swatting the beast, little beast, or wasp or something. Look at that other life that is precious and learn to respect it, different from ours. We're not to anthropomorphize them or attribute human feelings with them or give them names or pet names or anything. Just look at it. I was once, I remember, I used to go quite a lot to a sort of resort, a sort of holiday intellectual resort in America called Chautauqua. You may have seen it on the news because that was where Salman Rushdie was shot at. And I was sitting there, we were sitting having drinks on the porch in the evening, and a wasp fell into the wine glass of one of my neighbors. And we all looked at this thing buzzing around in the wine, and a Buddhist was sitting with us, and he said, "I'll take this, I'll see to this." And he took it out into the kitchen and came back with a fresh glass of wine, and he said, "And the wasp is fine." But we can all do something like that, just recognizing that these things have life, that they are themselves sacred, just taking ourselves out of this anthropocentric worldview. And there's also, I think, something that we could, a Buddhist exercise that we could all perform. Our when people do yoga, we see them going into themselves and sort of becoming sort of peaceful and calm and all the rest of it. But this was not what yoga was like at the time of the Buddha. If you wanted to become a sort of an ascetic, or you were interested in learning yoga, you went out into the forest and there you studied with a guru. And you were not allowed to start yoga, let alone, you couldn't even sit in the yogic position until you'd been through a very stringent moral program. And top of the list of that moral program was the Indian virtue of ahimsa, non-violence or harmlessness. So if you were seen swatting a fly, you were right down to the bottom of the class. No, if you spoke an unkind word or made an impatient gesture, you were not allowed to sit in that position until you could look at all things with equanimity and respect. You could not even begin yoga. And when we see the Buddha, often he seems to be looking down deeply inside himself, as if he's going right down into the depths of his inner world, his inner soul. But the Buddhist texts tell us something different. That what he was doing was extending his mind to every corner of the earth and not leaving it until he could feel respect and affection for every single creature within it. Whether, even a fly, or even things that are unpleasant. But extending that affection to it. There's a story about the Buddha that when he was a child, he was taken with his family to see the first ploughing of the field at the beginning of the agricultural year, which was a sort of big festival and a big celebration. And he was a little boy, and he was left in the care of his nurses. And his nurses, however, sort of abandoned the child and went off to watch the ploughing. And the Buddha, little boy, he looked and he saw that the plough had torn up plants, and some of the insects had been killed in the process. And his heart was filled with sorrow for them. And in that moment, he said to ascend to a high yogic stance, in that sense of pity and love for other creatures. But so in his bid for enlightenment, he would not leave each district in the world, each of the four corners of the world, until he could feel equanimity and respect for everything, even unpleasant, evil things, to feel respect and honor. And that was how he achieved nirvana, enlightenment, in that way. And there's a story that that one day the Buddha was preaching, and some forest people came to talk to him. And they said, look, we can't do all this yoga stuff. We're rough people. We haven't got time for any of this. Buddha said, don't worry. And he gave them a prayer to say. It's a prayer in the ancient Pali canon. He said, just extend your sympathies out to others, leaving yourself behind and feeling respect, honor, and affection for everything around you, starting with those near you, and then going further, like as the Buddha did, further and further away, until you can feel equanimity. Let all beings be happy, is the prayer. It's at the end of the book. and I think we should say it on ourselves to the bus, of high, middle, or low estate, alive or still to be born, may they all be perfectly happy. May our loving thoughts fill the entire world, above, below, behind, and treating all things with equanimity and love. It's a nice prayer. You can just say it to yourself on the bus, but extending our sympathies out to people we like or people we don't like, this is the way to do it, not looking within, not yogaing unless you're also doing, because don't sit in the yogic position if you've been unpleasant to somebody today. Because this is wouldn't have even been allowed to start in ancient India. But that is getting the perspective out. It's getting rid of the self, that ego that makes ourselves all feel so present and important. And I finished the book. I started with Wordsworth, and I finished the book with The Ancient Mariner, with Coleridge, Wordsworth's great friend. And I never liked that poem much at school. We had to all had to learn it by heart and draw pictures of various bits of it and handed it. Now I've got it. Like Wordsworth, he's worried about nature. And you know the story, of course. This old sailor accosts a wedding guest, that unfortunate guy who was hoping to go to the wedding, and gets told this long, sad story about how his life changed. And he was a sailor, and he goes, his ship sails, and they get becalmed in the Antarctic region. And then suddenly, out of the blue, an albatross appears. And it's a large white bird with long, slender wings, and it appears on the ship. And it becomes the ship's mascot. And it flies with the ship, and it leads it out of this icebound sea. And it becomes absolutely loved by all the sailors. And then the wedding guest notices that the mariner has grown very, very pale. "What's the matter with you?" he said. "Why ailst thou so?" And the mariner replies, "With my crossbow, I shot the albatross." And there's no reason for it. Probably hadn't got a reason. He might have just done it out of sheer carelessness. But this is what we do all day long. We chuck things away without thinking what we're doing. We step on flies. We are not noticing what we're doing. We don't notice what we're damaging. And to make ourselves aware that breaks the bond that we have with nature. And of course, you know the story. Eventually, the mariner comes to his senses. It was a terrible trial, and the crew all die. And he looks into the sea, and he's still filled with such anger and loathing at what's happened, that he looks at the sea and he looks at the fishes, and he sees the ugly, slimy things. They lived on, and his fellow mariners are all dead. They lived on, and so do I. Alone, all alone on a wide, wide sea. But one night, and Coleridge does this, it's very well worth it. There's beautiful lines in the whole thing, but he does it in prose. Has a little prose gloss beside it. That's how he looked up at the moon, which he'd hitherto seen as just a rather boring, sterile planet. But he suddenly saw the moon as rather like himself, as an endless traveller, travelling through the world, perhaps longing for home, as he did. And he felt an instant sympathy with it. And then he looked back at the fish and, "Oh, happy living things," said I. "You know, no tongue their beauty can declare." And a spring of love gushed from my heart, and I blessed them unaware, a sort of a sudden moment of union with other beasts, and immediately the spell is broken. But how often we do things like shooting an albatross. We may not kill a bird, but swat flies, chuck things away carelessly without giving these things a single thought. And it is breaking the bonds of nature, which will rebound upon us. So, as I say, I really felt when I was writing my book, for the first time, I think I thought I really understood what this book had been about, which I'd had to learn by heart at school. But it is something that we should remember, because stories get to us much more in many ways than just poems or even long discourses. The story stays in our mind and heart. Just notice how carelessly we're still leaving plastic on the beach, even though we're told again and again and again that this is absolutely dangerous. We're still doing it. And we're still turning on our heating when we don't need to. Flying, I mean, we're flying all over the place. And should we be flying all over the place? Because we know it's damaging the atmosphere. So we should become aware of that. Think of the albatross and the mariner, how carelessly, thoughtlessly we do things, and make ourselves aware of what we're doing, aware that each of these objects around us, each of these things we call them around us, has, as the Chinese understood, a life of its own that is sacred. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, very much, Karen.
Yes.
And your quality of attention is really special. We can feel it. Thank you very much. I'd like to go back to your childhood experience with nature, which you called push. The compelling luminous experience in the wood. I too had a direct experience with nature with the help of some psychedelics, mescaline. I thought that might help enliven the room a little bit. When I was 20, and everything changed for me after that. Could you share more particulars of your experience and those of other poets like Wordsworth and others you mentioned in your book about that direct experience?
Wordsworth does it very well, and I gave it that thought, the still sad music of humanity. Nor harsh nor grating, of ample power, a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something, something. It can be the least thing, but it has its life. It has its own integrity. Even a fly, that Uncle Toby's fly, has its own integrity. Or that wasp that the Buddhists rescued from the wine glass. And we need to make ourselves aware of the integrity of living things around us. We have just been treating them too long as objects, as things that we can use and change, and we've done great things, and with medicine and all this is wonderful. But we have also been careless with not seeing each thing as precious, like those flowers. Each of them is unique. And we take them for granted too much. And make ourselves look at the birds who are just hopping around. And when you're sitting, doing that 10-minute sit in the garden, notice the busyness of these birds. Their constant activity, their focus on living things and nature and eating things and feeding its young, and that life. But because we just need to waken ourselves up to that. And what was the question again?
Any more particulars about the push experience?
I was only little and I didn't have language properly, but it was a strange kind of luminousness. And I lived in the countryside. I lived in Worcestershire, in England, which right rather out in the country, and with lovely, beautiful woods around where we used to go. And it was just a strange luminosity there in the woods. And words, I recognize it when Wordsworth says, that he could see this thing, something similar to. There was when meadow grow, when the world and every common sight to me did seem apparelled in celestial light, the glory and the fragrance of a dream. It is not now as it hath been of yore. It's gone. As it goes with adulthood. It goes with the way we're educated at school and into the rational world. But I remember being sort of immensely worried about animals and things. Immensely worried about what animals and butterflies, just what would happen to them. And but that all goes. We just tend to see these things as side sort of parts of decorations in our lives, perhaps a nuisance to us if they're buzzing around, or and we don't see them as special. And I think as a child, everything is so new. We haven't got preconceived ideas of what things are. We haven't got concepts to put on things yet. We haven't got language much. And so many things are new, and feelings that we have which we can't possibly describe. But that, I think, you probably are more aware and open to nature then. And then, of course, it all gets drummed out of you at school, where you are made to form a sort of a rational view of the world. But I remember being very, very sort of annoyed with my parents as they kept producing, oh, here's Dolly then, for you. This is what you're looking for. And I said, no, it's Pooch, you fool. Because there it was. And they couldn't see it. And soon I wouldn't see it either. It's certainly gone. But children, I think, watch them. They probably see things that are seeing life in an entirely different way.
In your book, you say we need good myths to help change our whole belief system. What would that look like?
Well, a myth has become very downgraded in our language, hasn't it? When we say, that's a myth, it means it didn't happen. But in the ancient world, a myth is something that in some sense happened once, but which also happens all the time. In some sense happens once, but also happens all the time. It has a sort of universal capacity, and we sort of look out for it. What was the question again?
What would good myths look like? I mean, we need to change our whole belief system and scale up in a way.
Yes.
for massive change, what kind of a massive myth would work?
I don't think we're going to start making up myths, frankly. I don't think that will be helpful. And I don't think we'll be able to do it. We're too rational. But I think we've got to start looking at nature in a different way. No, just I think perhaps to start noticing the specialness of something, just the specialness of, say, that wasp, its busyness, its the beauty of a flower, the extraordinary nature, the fact every morning the sun rises, and every evening it sets, and very beautiful it is. We don't notice these things anymore. And I was mentioning at lunch or somewhere earlier about how the Egyptians would follow the course of the sun because they found it so miraculous that every day the sun rose. And they had a whole scenario, the priests, whereby they followed it imaginatively throughout the day, because in Egypt, of course, it's cloudless, and you see the sun literally going up into the heaven and then down at night. So they worked out a whole scenario of it. Then at night it went into the ground and died, and it's killed. It dies as the darkness comes, and then it's revived by the dawn in the morning. Who revives the sun, and then it starts rising again, and that sense of following the sun, not taking it for granted, seeing it as miraculous that we are living in a universe which is so impeccably astonishing, that has enabled life to thrive against all odds on this extraordinary little planet of ours. And we no longer wonder at it. What the Egyptians were doing was sort of, by these myths, eliciting within themselves a sense of wonder and gratitude, and a sense of unity with nature, which we don't have. Now, I'm not suggesting that we sort of start creating Egyptian-style myths, but just start noticing these things, noticing that it is marvelous that the sun rises every day. And of course, for the Egyptians too, when every year the Nile flooded and soaked all their fields, inundated all, and this enabled them to build their economy, because agriculture was possible in this otherwise very desolate, arid region. And this was seen. There was a whole stories about how this arose, and the myths helped. They tell a story, but they're pointing to something that is wonderful, and we're losing that sense of wonder. And I think it's no good, as I say, us making up myths, but I think poetry can help us. I love poetry. And I studied it at Oxford and all that, and I love it. Not everybody likes poetry, though. I know. When I was as a teacher telling out would come your poetry books, and there'd be a groan from the class. But try and find something to make us marvel at the fact that we are living in this extraordinary universe which has enabled life that works every day and that which we are destroying carelessly.
Your book points out that most faiths emphasize nature, but the Bible doesn't focus on it.
No.
What is your advice to Christian leaders for better cultivating a relationship with nature in light of this?
You see, I didn't mention this in my talk, but the monotheisms took on a different view. Instead of seeing the divine in the forces of nature, they saw it in the events of history, in the Exodus from Egypt, for example, or in the life of Jesus Christ. And that has value too. I mean, don't knock it. They're very important lessons that we can learn from looking at the importance of human events and the sacredness of human events. And but that was not the Islam is different. The Quran. I've said this earlier to some of you in the green room, I think. The Quran sees nature as a revelation that is equal to the Quran itself, a revelation of the divine that is equal. And there are extraordinary passages in praise of nature, which is astonishing when this scripture was composed in Saudi Arabia, what is now Saudi Arabia, with this hideous climate. Hideous climate. And the Arabs, before the coming of Islam, had no time for nature at all. They were half starved. There just wasn't enough food they could grow for everybody, so they had to fight each other to get to live. They were all suffering from extreme malnutrition. But here is the Quran, where extolling the wonderful, just like the Egyptians, the fact that the wonderful regularity of nature, that the sun rises, that the moon rises, whereas in our scriptures, we focus on miracles, disturbances of nature, things that are unnatural, people suddenly walking out of tombs or that kind of thing. And yes, thanks. Thanks. So we developed a different. Now it's important because we do need to look at history deeply, as the monotheisms do. We do need to learn lessons from history, and perhaps even see the divine there. But it does mean we need to sort of focus more on the natural, on the things of nature, and also with the Quran, just don't think that just because you've got a copy of the Quran and you read it and you find it rather boring, it's not meant to be read. It's meant to be listened to. Quran means recitation, and it's a great art form. It's sung and chanted. It's a great art to be able to do that. And it wasn't ever read in the way that we would read prose or read our Bibles, for example. You listen to it. And like all great music or song, it speaks to one at a very, very profound level.
This really wasn't in your book, but I'm asking about grief, climate grief, eco-anxiety over immeasurable loss. What might religious practices teach us about healthy grief resolution and to get us motivated to act?
Well, when we feel grief or feel feared, I think we should start be feeling rather frightened now. We've seen the way the climate has changed. Even this last year, we've had some really alarming weather. Grief, anxiety, and also a sense of sorrow, I think, that what we've done. We've been careless, like the mariner just shooting the albatross, just off, not giving it a second thought. And we do that kind of thing every day. And we've become heedless. Whereas in the ancient religions, you spent a lot of time and energy revering nature and cultivating that sense of it. We've just basically treated it as a resource and not noticed. Now we should start feeling real grief, I think, and start looking at the pathos of what's happening to people around the world who are already suffering very severely because of what we've all been doing. There should be sorrow, and we shouldn't just push it to the back of our minds, I think. We've got to be aware of what we're doing, aware of the preciousness and our utter dependence upon nature, what the next generation will have to deal with because of our carelessness. And not that we sort of are paralyzed with grief and depression, because that just makes us sink into a torpor where we can do nothing. But not, I was sitting with a friend a couple of weeks ago, and she lives near Heathrow. And it has been rather blissful for her during the pandemic, when, of course, there weren't. But sitting in this garden, she's got a lovely garden, and these huge planes, every minute, roaring over our heads. And where are we all going? I mean, I felt really guilty getting on the plane coming here. Is it really necessary? And the way we immediately, after the end of the pandemic, rushed to the airports to go on holiday, then we don't seem to be able to understand, like killing the albatross, what it is we're actually doing. Perhaps we should ration ourselves to say two flights a year or something. Just as, we rationed ourselves during the war, World War II. And start realizing that if we want the next generation not to suffer a hideous indignity and pain and terror, we must stop behaving so carelessly, like shooting albatrosses all the time.
So we always have fun with this afterlife question, and I have a different angle for you this time.
Okay.
One of our past speakers and one of my heroes, the late Edward O. Wilson, the acclaimed biologist, two-time Pulitzer winner, established the science of biodiversity. But he was basically an atheist, and he didn't expect a personal afterlife. He described his idea of human eternity in one of his last books called Half the Earth, saying you're part of diversity if you help, you're part of eternity if you help diversity. And if you invest in nature, you'll go on in nature.
That's beautiful. Yes. I like it.
You like it?
Yes, I do. I mean, I rather like this gentleman. I don't believe that there's a heaven or a God.
No, he didn't. He was not expecting that. He thought it would be boring.
Yes, I did as a child, I remember. I remember saying, I don't think I want to go to heaven, because I had been told that we'd be singing Glory Be to God all day long. I thought, no. I mean, this sounds far too tedious. So I have no belief in a personal God now. No, none at all. And because the more I read about the sacredness, as I tried to describe in other faiths, that sees the divine as ubiquitous, as everywhere, as a force that pulses through, but not as a being. I can't do that now. I really can't. And I don't believe in heaven. And I haven't really thought where I shall probably be, fertilize the earth or something. But I think, I've had a very lucky life. I've had a difficult time sometimes, but I've had a very fortunate life. I've kept my health, and I'm now quite old, and I'm still pretty healthy. And this is something to be thankful for. And if I've done something to help the world, then I'd be very happy. That's a great privilege. So no, I'm not looking forward to dying or getting ill or anything of that sort, but I'm not expecting to fly up to the Imperium or something. I don't think that they'll be all waiting for me at the Golden Gates. I think that I will disappear and be become part. If we have an Earth, be part of that.
This is a fun question. Your books take us to remote pasts and places like ancient Egypt, the actual age of rational Greece, Confucian China, European beginnings of science. Where do you think you'd be comfortable? Where would you fit if you had a choice? Where would you like to be?
I don't know. You see, I would be a woman still, wouldn't I? And there wouldn't be much hope for me there. So I think I think I'm very lucky to be a woman today in this climate, in this country, and in my own country, and to have had the education and the chances that I've had, which my own mother never had, let alone previous generations, and so that. I can't see myself fitting into these other, because I'd be one of those. I wouldn't have been a very successful wife, I don't think, and I've absolutely no use of things like cooking and needlework and things. I was the despair of my fellow nuns in the convent because of my bad cooking, and my sewing was atrocious, and we did nothing but sew all day long when I was in. So all those female things, which I would be having to do, I can't see myself doing them really. So I think I can't see myself going back to any of those times.
Thank God for the present.
Yes, thank God for the present. And I'm glad I'm a woman, but I'm also glad that I'm a woman today, and in a world that allows me to be free and to have been educated and to have the privileges that I've had.
This is my last question. What are your hopes for sacred nature and its reception?
I never allow myself to hope.
Hope?
Hope, no.
You don't allow yourself to hope?
No, I'm a real pessimist. Because I think once you start putting worry, you just write the book, and I enjoy writing the book, and I am utterly involved, and I do it the best I possibly can. But then it goes out into the world, and sometimes it's lovely, and everyone says wonderful things, but not always. And but if you're just doing it because you're going to get mentioned in the New York Times or something, that's not enough. I enjoy writing and researching so much that's a privilege in itself to do it. But I don't let myself think about the book and how it's going to go, because some people get really wrought up about ringing up the publishers every week to see how many people have sold and how it's selling there, and I leave that to my agents, and they rope it all in and just go on working. I don't want to become one of those people that are, and I've been very lucky. Fortunately, I've been able to make a living out of it. And at one point, when I had to leave teaching because of ill health and various other failures in my life, things looked rather grim, as I'd never married, and I didn't know quite what would happen to me. And so I've been very fortunate and very glad that my books have enabled me to live in a comfortable, privileged way. But I just send them out, and you do your best, and then it's out of your hands, really. And some people spend hours rushing to the newspapers to see whether there's a review in it. I don't even like reading reviews, and you can become too sort of obsessed with that. Whereas the point is writing, not how, and if people like it, fine. But a lot of people, I mean, as I say, I do very badly in England, my own country. They don't like religion, and they continually say, "Oh God, cards!" And my friend, when are you going to write something interesting for a change? so I get sort of really pushed in my place, really, and then none of them read them. I hand them out sometimes. And they, "Oh, thank you very much," and it goes in the shelf, and that's the end of it. But for me, it is, writing is hard, very hard, but what is lovely is the research, the reading and the finding out of things, and that's what I really enjoy.
Karen will sign books at the end. We've got a time problem here, and this really has been a special audience. There's been a meditative quality about your attention, and we can feel it. It's really special.
Yes.
Thank you for being a part of this. And Karen, this is your third clock I'm going to give you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for a beautiful evening.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again for joining us. Please consider a donation if you can, and get your copy of Sacred Nature at the link. Until next time, do take care.